I recently moved into a new flat with my mate. As we were moving our stuff in, there was a guy sitting outside the building, smoking. He introduced himself as Steve and told us he lived in the flat directly below ours. He was a skinny guy with really intense eye contact, a bald head, and what looked like a small scar on his cheek, but he seemed friendly enough. As he finished his cigarette, he said, "You're not going to be loud, are you?" And we told him we weren't. Later that first day, as we were unpacking our stuff, we noticed that there was one floorboard that squeaked a bit as we walked over it. Anyway, a few days went by and there was a knock at the door. It was Steve. He asked if we'd settled in okay, and I said yeah. He said good and asked if we could just remember to keep the noise down. We literally hadn't made any noise. We hadn't even played music or anything. Anyway, to keep the peace, I said I'd make sure we're quiet. Anyway, a week or so went by and we hadn't heard any more from him, so we assumed everything was fine. Then we received this envelope to our flat. It was addressed to the boys at Flat 4. I opened it and it was a birthday card, which was random because it was neither of our birthdays. Then I opened the card and it was covered in scrawl. It was from Steve. He was saying how he's tried to ask us nicely, but we hadn't listened and that we'd disrespected him and should have just been reasonable. It was completely insane and even weirder that it was in a birthday card. That night at about 11 p.m., I heard screaming and banging from below. I couldn't exactly make out what exactly I assumed Steve was saying, but he sounded furious. He seemed to be using an object, maybe a broom, to bang on his ceiling so we'd hear it on our floor. We literally hadn't made any noise since we moved in except for that squeaky floorboard. He kept screaming until about 3 a.m. It was horrendous. When I left the house the next day, I had to peek out to make sure he wasn't around before dashing out the door. I was so tired all that day. That night, at the same time, it happened again. He screamed and banged and swore at us from his flat all night. By the third night, we were going out of our minds, so we called the police. They came round, but they said all they could do was ask him to be quiet. He hadn't actually hurt us or threatened violence, and he was in his flat, they said, so he could technically do what he liked. I couldn't believe how useless they were. The next day was Friday. My flatmate had gone away for the weekend to see his girlfriend. I'm a musician and I had a gig at a bar until pretty late in the evening. When I came home at about midnight, I could see Steve as I was walking down the street. He was sitting outside our building, drinking and smoking. I turned around and walked away before he saw me. I called a friend and asked if I could crash on their sofa. When I got home the next day, he'd slid a piece of paper under the door that had the word quiet on it, in all capitals and about 6 exclamation marks. I'd switched the shower on and got undressed when suddenly there was banging on our flat door. He was hammering the door over and over again and screaming that he was going to kill me. I quickly threw my clothes back on and stopped the shower. I was terrified that he was going to break the door down and get in. Remembering what the police said, I grabbed my phone and recorded him screaming through the door, threatening to kill me. Then I called the police and they sent someone out. They took over an hour to arrive and he'd stopped banging by then. I showed the police the recording and they said they would have a word with him again. However, they said he could easily deny the recording was of him, so until they actually caught him threatening to harm us, that's all they could do. By the time my flatmate got back, we'd already received another letter from him. This was even weirder. He asked us why we did this to him and what has he ever done to us. He called us bullies and said he wouldn't be bullied by us. Then at night there was the shouting and banging again. All this went on for about a month in total. We were exhausted, nervous wrecks the whole time. Eventually, we decided to find somewhere else to live. The estate agents let us break our contract early after we repeatedly complained to them about the situation. While we were waiting to move into my new flat, We borrowed money from our parents and stayed in a hotel for a week. When we went back to pack our things, the door to our flat had a boot mark on it, and we had 3 more letters from him, all of them completely crazy and unnerving. It was my birthday a few months later, and my mum actually sent a card with money in it to my old address. I didn't even dare go and collect it in case he was there. That was by far one of the most stressful times of my life, and I can't believe how useless the police were. When I was 8, my family and I lived in a tough part of town. Everyone kept themselves to themselves. We had a neighbor on each side, and one of them would occasionally say hello, but one wasn't friendly at all. He was a real weirdo, actually. I don't remember much about him, just a vibe, but my mum does. This particular night in question was just like any other. It was just my mum, my brother and sister, and me at home because my dad was on a business trip. Around midnight, someone knocked on our door. My mum wakes up, goes to the door, and asks who it is. No one answers. She figures it's probably some naughty kids playing knock-a-door run and goes back to bed. Then about half an hour later, there's another knock at the door. This time my mum peeks out of a bedroom window to see if she can see anyone, but she can't. In a nice neighborhood, this wouldn't be particularly alarming, but where we lived, you had to prepare for the worst. So my mum was pretty worried at this point. She got a big knife from the kitchen and sat in the dark in the living room. She didn't wake us up because she didn't want to scare us. She just waited. 15 minutes later, there was more knocking. My mum shouted at them through the door that she had a knife and she would use it if they came in. She also told them she was going to call the police. The knocking stopped. Around 2 a.m., the police came. Mum woke us up just in case they needed to speak to us. The cops searched around our house and found a piece of barbed wire about as long as your forearm near the door. They said whoever it belonged to had clear plans to hurt my mum with it. They told her she did the right thing by not answering the door. The police sat outside our house in their car and made sure we were safe. Once it was light enough, they had a second look around the outside of the house and found footprints leading to my bedroom window. And there were marks and dents in the seal where someone had tried to break in. My mum has always suspected it was the creepy neighbor because she'd often catch him staring at her menacingly when she was carrying in bags of shopping or whatever. He was so creepy and weird too. Plus, he always seemed to know when my dad was away. When my dad got back, we told him what happened. He was so angry he wanted to confront the neighbor, but we stopped him. We actually moved house a few months later. A new neighbor moved in next door to me recently. We didn't get along with our old neighbors because they were always leaving notes and making a fuss about small things, so I welcomed a fresh start with someone new. However, things got strange almost immediately. When they first arrived, my wife and I were coming back from our morning coffee when we saw a van we didn't recognize parked in their driveway. They didn't seem to be moving any furniture though because it wasn't a big van and there was no removal lorry around. We wanted to be friendly and make a good first impression, so we went to introduce ourselves and offer to help, but no one answered the door even though there was a car there as well. However, we could see their backyard and the side of their house from our bedroom window upstairs. They had a detached garage set back where the new neighbor, a man, was moving boxes. We didn't want to be nosy neighbors, so we stopped watching. Nothing particularly interesting was happening anyway. That night, we were half asleep when we heard his garage door opening, and out of curiosity, we got up, pulled the curtain back slightly, and looked out of the bedroom window to see what he looked like. His outdoor light lit him up. He was middle-aged, in fairly good shape, and about 6 foot tall, I'd say. A few days later, we noticed we hadn't seen his car in the drive at all. Again, we heard sounds coming from the garage at night, though. There were scraping sounds, which I thought was probably him moving boxes. But there was also this metallic sound, like scraping on metal, that was constant. I got up and looked out my window again, and this time he saw me looking at him, and I felt embarrassed and stepped back from the window. I decided to go out and say hi and explain that I was just wondering what the noise was, so I went downstairs in my pajamas. As soon as I stepped outside, I saw that he was already in his van with the engine running, and he rushed away as soon as I got close. This all felt weird in my gut. Why did he dart off when he could clearly see me coming? And what was that metallic scraping sound I'd heard? Curious to know what was going on, I snuck around to his backyard and heard thumping sounds in the garage. Before I could investigate further, my wife stopped me. She'd come out to check I was okay. About an hour later, my wife heard our backyard gate open. It was late now, but neither of us were asleep. I went to check on it, but there was nothing there. The next day, I spoke to another neighbor named Richard, who had also heard odd sounds from the new guy's garage. We decided we'd investigate together if we heard more noises. After that, one morning I saw the new neighbor watching me from his window. He stared at me. I waved, but he didn't wave back. He just carried on staring for a bit. I went over with my wife, but he didn't answer the door. Then Richard came across and joined us, and we all sensed that something was definitely off. The next day, his van was gone, and it's been weeks since we've seen him. We don't know where he went, and we still hear strange noises at night. We're unsure if we'll ever get to know the truth, and at this point, we'd definitely rather have our old neighbors back.